Okay, so in this session, we basically have an example of um, the change in use asset as per the adjusted cost. So we spoke about the requirements in terms of an asset that would likely change from having been a portion of a given percentage in terms of the taxable supplies versus the exempt supply session. So you can get an asset that would likely move in between departments that would maybe entail it to be taxable supplies on the one end and the one end being exempt supplies. So that asset would also likely or the company rather would also likely have a structure that basically entails it to be producing taxable supplies at a given rate as well as non-taxable supplies at a given rate, as we've elaborated with a particular example. So before we basically get into this issue, I just want to make you aware that I do bear with those that do not see the actual board properly. I understand that we've got a bit of a challenge in that regard, so please just bear with me. But however, if you're to pay special attention to what I'm basically saying and reading out as to what I was basically writing on the whiteboard, you'll also be able to get the main information that I intended to share with you as per the whiteboard, which may not be in its clearest form. So as the heading in this part, I basically labeled this session 100% taxable supply to 100% exemption part. We've dealt with that portion. So now we're dealing with a situation. We've dealt with this example, which was in the previous clip that we dealt with. But in this session now, in the what I've written down, the adjusted cost that we're basically focusing on is one in which an asset now goes from being a decrease in taxable supply, basically. So there's a decrease in taxable supply side of the actual asset. So it previously used to be used as a taxable supply to a higher degree in terms of the percentage, whereas that degree has now been reduced and the exempt side of the actual side of that asset would have actually increased in value, whereas the taxable side of the actual asset would have actually reduced in value. That's basically what we're trying to say. So if there's a decrease in an asset which was apportioned in that regard, that would mean that if there's a decrease, it would mean that, for instance, if the asset was basically an asset that was deemed to be 60% taxable, that would mean that it used to claim input VAT at 60%. So now it's decreased in value. That means that value of the input VAT is basically no longer sitting at 60%. It's sitting at a reduced percentage, which is likely going to be less than 60%. In this particular instance, we'll basically elaborate that. So it goes as follows. It says Poly Ltd bought a digital printer for 300,000 rands in its media business. At that time, Poly Ltd had 60% taxable supplies and 40% exempt supplies. They had a restructuring of some sort in their business, and in the current year, if I can maybe repeat that line, they had a restructuring of their business in the current year, right? In the current year, they'll make 20% taxable supplies and 80% exempt supplies. So they used to make 60% taxable supplies. Now they've gone down to 20% taxable supplies, and they used to have 40% exempt supplies. Now they've got 80% exempt supplies. That means the actual VAT that used to be claimed at 60% has now been reduced to 60% to 40%. That means that VAT is not getting the benefit of what these people would have initially claimed that input VAT on. So SARS is not happy about that. There are certain criteria that will have to be applied in this situation. So the first part of actually getting to also apply these criteria to that particular asset is that there's a specific requirement that says that such changes of those assets are only meant for assets that would have been capital in nature assets, and they would have had to have a cost which is more than 40,000 rands excluding VAT. So that is the first basic requirement we have to basically look at first before we can actually get into the crux of the actual calculation. So we need to understand that that asset needs to be likely a capital in nature, a capital asset, which would have had a cost of more than 40,000 rands. So it looks like we within those parameters, excluding VAT, the 40,000 rands. Let's not repeat ourselves. So in this instance, so if we had an asset that used to have 60% taxable supplies, now reducing itself to 20% taxable supplies, right? That means it used to claim VAT at input VAT was formerly levied at 60%. You know, so SARS would have expected input VAT of that output VAT to have at least risen out of like 60% as well, in order for us to have like a net of effect in a normal transaction. If they were not to do anything funny, that they may be sold, you know, they would still get like the 60% output. That would be SARS. So now they've gone over, they haven't sold the asset, but now the asset has suddenly changed to be a 20% taxable supply asset. So it's suddenly gone up to 80% exempt supplies. So SARS is saying, no, we will not have any of that. So when there's a decrease in input, what is the inverse of basically making an adjustment to basically say? So for us to actually get an, if input has decreased, how do we actually basically like, you know, how do we decrease? How, because we want to get SARS into the same position. So how do we now increase input VAT so far as SARS perspective? We'll have to recognize an output VAT to SARS, because there's a 40% change of output VAT that we need to recognize. So we're going to use the percentage of 30% change, right? And we're going to times that by either the cost, which is the adjusted cost, all right, or the market value of that asset. And we're going to use the lower of the two, right, the lower. And we're going to times that by 15 over 115 in order for us to get an output VAT that should be recognized because of the movement of this asset. So at that point, then we got 40% at this point, which we will multiply by the lower of the adjusted cost. So what was our adjusted cost? We originally bought the asset for 300,000 rands, so that would have made it our adjusted cost, right?